Okay. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I also want to extend a warm welcome to those who are following this lecture online. I'm Antonella Ceccano. Many of you know me already from the University of Bologna, and I am very pleased to introduce today's lecture by Professor Prof Alden, one of the world's leading experts on China and Africa. Prof Alden is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Director of LSI. He is the author or co-author and editor of numerous books, including New Directions in Africa-China Studies, published in 2018 by Routledge, China and Africa, Building Peace and Security Cooperation of the Continent, published in 2017, and many others, including, as well as having written numerous articles in internationally recognized journals. Most recently, in 2023, he has co-authored China and Latin America, Development Agency and Politics, and Geopolitics, sorry. For the sake of brevity, I have abbreviated a very rich and long CV, but those who are interested can access the full CV. Professor Prof Alden will talk to us about China-Africa relations in the new era. And I think that you will agree with me that this is certainly a new era, with the global status quo being constantly challenged and new wars near and far that are tagging this period of history. So again, around, I think that today's topic is even urgent, more compelling. Professor Alden's lecture is organized and sponsored by the Department of Languages, Literature and Cultures of the University of Bologna and by AISAC, which is the newly founded Italian Association Study of Africa and China. And together with my colleagues and co-founders of AISAC, Maria Sole Pepa, Elisa Gambino, and Costanza Franceschini, who are here with us today. I thank Professor Prof Alden for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Whenever you're ready.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Professor Antonella, Elisa, colleagues at AISAC. This is a very a real privilege to be here and have an opportunity to talk to you about that. There we go. Even better. So as I was saying, thank you to colleagues here who organized this. It's a real privilege to be here. And I will go forward with my discussion on China relations in the new era. What I'd like to talk about is sort of four basic themes here. One is to suggest that the period between roughly the end of the 1990s to 2020, the COVID interregnum, we see, if you like, a golden era, an era of possibility defined by what China could do for Africa, how Africa could engage effectively with this new emerging power that brought different ideas, different resources, different thinking and modalities engagement with the continent. So this period, which characterized the study of China-Africa or Africa-China, is one that is how we've defined the relationship up till now. It's how we've thought about it. We've asked questions around that. And I think one of those key questions that permeated the Western scholarship, to a lesser degree, the other scholarship out of China, certainly, and in Africa, but was how was China going to change Africa? What is the impact of an emerging power in an area that had been so long dominated by the West? What impact was that going to have? And there were debates around it. It was folded into a larger debate about what is China the great power? Is it to be socialized? And these questions emerged in very specific terms in the development arena where China was present. China offering an alternative was seen to be a challenge in some way to the prevailing practices, if not norms, that guided Western involvement in Africa, and the responsiveness of Africans to that was critical. So we're going to look looking at the golden age, look at development partnerships or new reconfiguration of the relationship. One, the development partnership 2.0. Secondly, the security partnership 2.0. Third, the diplomatic partnership 2.0. So I'm framing it in that kind of arguably catchy approach, but I think there's many details and overlapping, as you'll see, of those distinctive features. So as I said, the golden era characterized Africa-China, China-Africa relations. And it was punctured by, towards the end of recent history, by a number of things that made for difficulties. One was the debt crisis. By 2019, we see that African debt had, in general, but China as a component of that debt was very much stymieing movement forward in terms of the relationship, the projects themselves were sometimes stalled for lack of new loans. Most notable sign of that was actually the Kenyan Standard Gauge Railway and the effort by Uhuru Kenyatta to convince China to carry on with that support that it had given. So sort of stopped midstream, and that was partly a function of the rising debt burden, the belief that the recognition or the belief that African governments were going to be able to meet their debt obligations, or at least were going to want to reschedule them in some way to account for the difficulties that they were experiencing economically. So the debt crisis ultimately got to a point where China in 2019, so on the cusp of COVID, and I think that's the important part here. It wasn't something that happened as a function of COVID, but it carried on in COVID. But the debt crisis, at the cusp of COVID 2019, China basically stopped lending. The big lending that we had seen that was characteristic even up to the 2017 was no longer the case. With that came a kind of a hold on mega projects. And again, it was announced in advance of the COVID crisis, which stalled the global economy. The idea that, as Xi Jinping had characterized it at a FOCAC meeting, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, no more vanity projects. They were trying to grapple with this idea that big projects that were in effect demand-driven, one of the signature features of China and Africa, right? That Africa defined what were the things that would characterize big development across the continent, that there was a problem with this demand-driven approach. It was producing things that made sense to African hosts, recipients, but didn't maybe make economic sense, wasn't economically viable, or had other features to it. So these mega projects were really, again, in 2019 and slightly earlier as well, were called into question as the primary vehicle for China-Africa. Economic engagement. China's domestic economy, the slowing of the economy, slowing down a bit, the rising debt burdens domestically, all of these things had spillover effects. Okay, again, exacerbated during the COVID period, so there wasn't a big startup within the economy. It's still finding difficulty to break the sort of 4%, if you believe the statistics out there, 4% growth and what have you. So that also changed the orientation. And then the last feature I would say is we're in the era where there's been a change at the systemic level, one that China has contributed to this new discourse around the new era, right? We're in a new era of great power competition, an era where the global transformations often discussed in the 2000s, certainly after 2009, is now in tow. It's happening, as Professor Antonella had said just now. So this era then changes some of the systemic factors that have been characteristic and enabled a relationship to thrive without the hard geopolitics questions. It was always snapping at the bottom, if you like, but it was not the primary response of Western governments to a Chinese position. It was a discourse response, principally, but not a content-based one. Seems to be stalled. Okay, so let's look at Development Partnership 2.0. First thing to point out is resources matter. In fact, they might matter more in some ways. Okay, and I'll explain that. What China is in fact began to grapple with in 2018 was the idea that there had to be another approach to characterize the development relationship, the partnership. And as Lauren Johnston says, that what we are seeing is a shift from the Angolan model, resources for infrastructure, debt financing, commodities, to one that is in the agricultural sector, in particular, Hunan model. We'll talk a little bit further about that in a minute. The most important part of the context, the evolving context for Africa, as China sees it, and as African economists see it, is the launching in 2018 of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which promises, and signatories are slowly accumulating, and some of the processes have been the opening of markets and lowering of barriers to trade are beginning to be followed in. Again, just like everything else, it was all in suspension because of COVID, right? So all of these activities were promised in 2018 out of the Rwanda AU summit, and took a while for that to restart again. But it promises to boost intra-regional trade, to do something that has not been a feature of the intra-African relationship, making Africa trade more with other African economies, binding those economies in a real way. And this was seen as a continental opportunity, right? From certainly from the continent, but also from outside, and China in particular. One of the responses we could see was in, as articulated by Xi Jinping at the BRICS summit, was to talk about setting up an initiative supporting African industrialization, second, a plan for assisting African cultural modernization, and third, a China-Africa talent cultivation and cooperation plan. So these are all these are restarting or deepening, I would say, industrialization, and reconfiguring it a bit, similarly with agriculture, and thirdly, in terms of training, etc. So what does that mean in content terms for industrial development? There's continued focus and growth of these, what are sometimes called special economic zones or industrial parks, is usually more readily employed in the African context, as sites for clustering resources, sites for gaining efficiencies in terms of infrastructure investment, improving improving the policy framework for seeking foreign direct investment, building more public-private partnerships, and also significantly building into these a place for secondary processing in the African context, so that this is about helping Africa industrialize, right? Giving Africa an opportunity in that area. Agricultural production, similar sorts of things, harmonization of production practices, training, enhancing training, public using clusters as well to produce sites for secondary processing, sometimes in Africa, sometimes in places like Hunan province, improving market access. So African agricultural products, which are beginning to pick up, selective ones are really beginning to pick up in and be known and penetrate markets within China. We're going to see more of that. And then in conjunction with that is the expansion of training programs, education and training that will raise the skill sets within Africa to help promote this and enable this environment. But I think there's another dimension to this, which isn't which needs to be focused on. I put this slide up just to show you the degree to which China dominates those resources necessary. Dominates by that, I mean it has a position in secured deals of one kind or another in the extractive side of resources needed for our green economy and the like, and also in terms of the downstream production side. It's the builder of the electronic vehicles, the batteries rather, as well as the vehicles themselves, and making great strides in that area. And what the development partnership 2.0 seems to promise is that Africa will be integral to that green economy. So it's both a Chinese position within that and also the larger shift away from fossil fuel, carbon, and the like. Given China's prominent position there, as I've said, downstream and upstream, it helps, being part of that is critical to, or that alignment between Africa and China is a critical component of it. There's a similar sort of discussion or debate around the food security question, which has in the last year raised its head considerably, not the least of which because we're seeing some of the food price rises, Ukraine, the volatility in that sector. We see, for instance, India. Those of you who read or remember 2008, there was a similar sort of spike after Thailand and closed its markets, and we see India saying we're not going to allow for export markets, right, in rice. So all of this is generating levels of concern that were already there, but are now accelerated. So raising Africa is part of that solution, if you like. But twofold, this is what I want to emphasize here. It's both a solution in terms of raising production and skill sets and building the complementary infrastructure that's necessary for being an exporter, integrating into Chinese-led value chains, utilizing this new infrastructure, that port infrastructure and the like, so that it's a good effect to increase its ability to export, agricultural training and the like. So this will have a spin-off effect of meeting African security needs, right? Because security is as much a problem, if not more, in Africa as it is in places like China. But it will also have a developmental impact, spillovers, positive spillovers, and the like. So African development aligns with global shifts in this way. The development partnership seems to promise that the future is that Africa is part of that future. At the same time, it suggests something. This is a theme of my lecture, is to want us to think just a little bit over the horizon. Deeper integration into Chinese-led global value chains, be it in the new green economy or old economy, if you like. Nonetheless, the key point is deeper integration. means deeper exposure to the politics and domestic volatility. So, which leads us rather nicely to talk about Security Partnerships 2.0. What do we have now? Where we stand now? We have consultation and information sharing at the bilateral level and at a mini-lateral level. By that I mean through the FOCIC or a spill-off over of the FOCAC process. We have defense ministerial level meetings with African defense ministers and Chinese counterparts. We have regional bodies where China has sat on or contributed to some of the discussions on managing the outbreak of conflict in Ethiopia, for instance, and that sort of thing. So we do have an established set of practices since 2012, when in the FOCAC setting, China and Africa committed to a partnership for peace, okay, peace and development. So we have institution in conjunction with that, and since 2018, FOCAC and the more modest, more recent FOCACs meeting, the online virtual form of it out of Senegal. What we see is still some bilateral institutional cooperation, okay, in the areas of training, and this is also connected to arms sales as well in some cases, which is very often, of course, the component for training is linked to the sale of arms by Western governments, Russia and the like. So this is not to be seen as a surprise. There's been a discussion of, and one presumes a commitment to, strengthening intelligence sharing, so to know more about crises in advance and things like that. And then shared policing, and here we see concrete evidence, transnational crime coming out of China or connected to, or Africans involved as such in the same. So this sort of, and questions of extradition of people who are accused of crimes. All of this sort of policing dimension has grown, the cooperative policing dimension. The other thing I'd say, though, is on the multilateral side, what you do see is essentially a pause. I'm not sure if I can call it scaling back, but it's a pause. What the story, as we academics told it, was one of continual movement towards greater and greater involvement. It was reflected in UN peacekeeping, and you can see books, articles, and what have you that presented that way. And I think the trajectory was going that way. But what we see is, while China has contributed to the Peace Development Fund, Peace Building Fund, and has in 2013, 2014 had moved from non-combatants in the peacekeeping dimension to ones who were involved in peace and security and the like. Has had five, I think, commanders of UN missions across Africa. That it's sort of, it hasn't gone beyond that. There's no, as perhaps it's a feature of the paralysis within the UN Security Council that prevails at this stage, but it hasn't been anxious apparently to have more peacekeeping troops in more exposed in these to violent conflict, in effect, right? It's done it, but it seems to be reflecting upon whether that is something that it wants to carry on and expand. Unlike, let's say, India, which has a very long and continued record in that area. Okay. So if you compare it with, if you like kind for kind, like for like countries, it's not really as engaged. It's sort of reached a high water mark, and it seems to be pausing on that area. Where it has, however, put its energy towards in matters of peace and security is mediation. And mediation certainly is held out as, and we've seen it not just in the Africa domain, but also the Middle East, is held out as a sort of card carrying, as China's card carrying activity. At the same time, if you dig a little deeper into the particulars of it, what you do see is a continued commitment a continued vocalization of mediation as an important part of Chinese diplomacy across Africa. Yet there are tensions around certain dimensions of it, and that certainly was borne out in the Horn Sudan question, the Sudan conflict, the conflict within Ethiopia. And for instance, in IGAD, which had been charged with the Sudan issue, there was China was not, the African governments did not want China ultimately to play a significant role. This is African ownership here. So the limits of China's role in mediation are on display in that regard. As compared to a less known and a much earlier event where China played a role in helping to broker the crisis within Zimbabwe between after the election, the MDC, the opposition figures, and the ZANU-PF contested the outcome. I would also say that where we aren't seeing China, and I'm going to make this point again, play a significant role, we would expect it to, is in the DRC, Democratic Republic of China, Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Great Lakes region as a whole. And as I said, the reason is not just goodwill and the sort of public goods argument in the security domain, but we're going to talk about interests. Okay, we'll come to that in a moment. I also think it's worth reflecting upon mediation as a method here. China's mediation seems to be predicated on the role on this idea of honest broker, right? We're not that involved. We are above the conflicts, and we will be able to, in that setting, mediate the conflicts well. But I think that if you look at sustained mediation practices of states, they have interests. They have very serious interests, and they use those interests to pressure sides, one side or the other. That's what China did in Zimbabwe, actually, pressuring the ZANU-PF to come to the table for a deal they didn't want to have. So I think that but in recent years, we haven't seen that kind of pressure, or that I'm aware of. And I think that China will need to do more of that and use its interests in that sort of way. Public goods as well, in terms of underwriting the process. It's not just about hosting and that sort of thing, but underwriting the guarantees monetarily, right? Looking over the actors and their commitments and if they do abide by them, and the punitive measures that come, sanctions, right, amongst other things. The utilization of that. Until recently, China was a reluctantly applied sanctions. Actually, in the last couple of years, we've seen a proliferation of Chinese punitive measures, if you like, towards certain issues as they were seen to challenge its foreign policy aims and interests. So it's much more comfortable with that. So we may be seeing it move into that area more readily. Mediation. China's capacity to utilize the UN Security Council to really mobilize in favor of a particular issue, right? To say, we want to put this on the agenda and we would like to see a multilateral response. We would build a project around those. It has done so in the past around Sudan. Can it do it now? With such a divided and divisive Security Council with global politics, everyone's measuring and counting now. You're helping me on this, I will help you. You're blocking me, I will block you. So it's a different environment. And then finally, I just wondered if there is a sort of Chinese mediation that we ought to think about at this particular to China. What I would note is the Western governments seem to have a compulsion to problem solve. The issue breaks out, and they may not be doing anything, but certainly the flurry of activity, doing anything substantive, but the flurry of activity is nearly immediate. China's position is much more about strategic patience. And if you think about mediation strategy, you think of William Zartman's The Herding Stalemate. He talks about, he says, you're not going to get mediation done until the parties all agree that the pain of trying to pursue conflict-oriented approaches is so great that we're willing to have serious discussions at the table, not pro forma ones, but real ones. So maybe strategic patience in this case is going to favor the Chinese approach. I don't know, but I just throw that out there. More particular to the security partnership is that expansion of interest, which I've mentioned, features in over recent years and in the future, as projected by China, the 2.0 development partnership. And of course, there's been an ongoing discussion about our bases on West African shores being, is there going to be a base or a leasing or a military agreement or whatever it would be, and different countries have been named as potential sources, and there's even discussion of Western governments blocking the achievement of an agreement in that regard. Irrespective, a bigger role in a greater role in interest presumes of economic interest presumes the need for some kind of security arrangement. So we're going to see some way to problem solve that particular problem, that issue rather, military agreements and the like. And I would also say we seem to have entered in Africa a new era of coups, of military coups. China's relationships have been often characterized as elite, very elite focused, elite agreements. The elites fall out of power, you're suddenly in some kind of, your interests may be in jeopardy, let's put it that way. So in a context where the elite interests are no longer the driver, it's be news to someone, this elite interest, they're phoning in. So this will, I think, damage, well, no, this is a challenge for China and the way it approaches securing its interests. So, and again, I'm going to ask a bigger question, a longer term question, which is the development security nexus is something that China always talks about when discussing security questions. And it says for Africa, the route to security, right, is to address the inequalities, the problems of development. If we want to find the sources, development is the solution. So we're now going to get a chance to test this in effect, right? Because this development 2.0 is now going to be held up against the degree to which it's able to roll out. And I would say it has to roll these gains out quickly, right? Roll out a growth environment where African inequalities in domestic Africa, or the kind of regional disparities, capital, periphery, what have you, are being addressed. And I guess the question is how committed is China really to that security development nexus and will it how will it shape the way it does security, or does it have to do security in ways that are more conventional and recognizable by by Western governments? My third part, and I think I'm still on time, is to look at the diplomatic partnership 2.0. And what we're seeing now, and I'm speaking very much to the contemporary. Okay, so there are all sorts of other things that could come into play, but I'm speaking to what I have access to and the like. China is positioning itself as a leader. It has always, but much more so in an activist way, as a leader of the global South, right? And part of that is seen through the lens of three key initiatives, right? The Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilizations Initiative. These are all been rolled out in the United Nations and discussed at the September General Assemblies by the Chinese leadership and the like. At the center of the first and most developed of all of these initiatives is a commitment to revitalizing in the aftermath of COVID and the economic paralysis that came with that, revitalizing the commitment to the SDGs so that developing countries and African countries as the place with the largest number of developing countries can begin to get that on track. Okay, so China is a leader for this key initiative that matters a lot to the global south. It's central, in fact. Concurrent with that, and if you look at the details of the development initiative, there are all the investment questions and the training and the sort of things that China is involved in Africa, but there's also a discussion about a more developmentalist reading of human rights. That is to say, it accords with that the idea that human rights follow from development. So this is something that the right to develop, as opposed to human rights in the classic depiction, it features in that. So that's something to keep an eye on and to think about. The global security initiative. Here again, promoting sovereignty and protection of that, non-intervention, as the most important source of stability in an international system. The kind of windmill tilting that Western governments have done has destabilized the system. That is the argument and certainly the evidence in the Middle East, most assuredly in the earlier crises of the Middle East, much less the present. So that commitment. And then third, the least developed of these initiatives, the Global Civilizational Initiative, seems to be oriented towards debunking the universality of Western values, but saying that actually there are all these civilizations that have their own set of values, and that these are the ones, this is the springboard for this is the value springboard for a multipolar world, right? So, but again, it's not developed yet, so I'm just extrapolating from threads in the air, as it were. In all of these cases, they're not just responsive to Africa, right? Africa has a view on all of these things, SDGs, perhaps the most obvious one of these, but it also is necessary to be successful in getting these things supported and what have you. So we have friends of the GDI, the Global Development Initiative, and Africa is well represented in that and the like. So you have a whole sort of mobilization strategy to get these things put forward on the agenda and supported and permeating through the UN system, as it were. And why this matters again is that I think it's part of, you could view this as a set of rhetorical positions, but I think it's important in terms of signaling the change in the balance of power, what it means in terms of some of the key purposes of the United Nations, insofar as it's about maintaining security, maintaining development, and underwriting that's a set of values there. So it will play a role in signaling the beginning of what multipolarity means, as opposed to the Western-led UN system. The challenge is all of this is happening in an era of great power competition. And one thing that I'm not sure has hit home yet is it's not all about the West. Competition comes from many sources in this world. For instance, Turkey and the Maghreb and the Horn, absolutely frustrating, and indeed in other places as well, in Tanzania, frustrating Chinese interests and economic interests and/or diplomatic interests in Libya. Conflict in economic interests in terms of building railway projects and the like. So this is one, or in Sudan and the mediation and with the port facilities arguments there. India, similarly, in terms of Mauritius, which is of course an island African state, and the degree to which Mauritius is really dominated now. If you talk to others in Mauritius, they are doing work on this, and they will say that Mauritius used to be non-aligned when it came to questions of China and India, but it's much more aligned with India. And they have a military base is being built for the Indian military amongst their islands. There's a security advisor of an Indian national on the Security Council there. We see similarly in Africa, India pushing commercial and diplomatic initiatives. So Gulf states too, more recently celebrated for their integration into BRICS, but they have very substantive interests across the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and those do not always align with Chinese interests. Right? So great power competition is not all about the West. The logic of multipolarity applies to Africa too. And that I don't think is the way we've been talking about it, and certainly it's been presented. So we need to think about that. I would throw another actor into the mix. Indonesia, slated to be the 6th largest economy by 2030, I think. Its primary point of economic departure has been Asia, ASEAN, and the like. But it's committed to engaging more deeply with Africa and sees that as the future. So the kinds of resources it puts to that, it's very strict adherence to non-alignment, right? It's unwillingness to join BRICS, though there was a great deal of, not pressure, but there was an expectation or hope that Indonesia would do so. These are all factors. The other thing I would say is that Africa, like other countries of the global south, are embracing a transactional form of diplomacy, of what they understand to be active non-alignment. You will be familiar with Jorge Hain and others who talk about active non-alignment. They've been doing the tour around the world, and one of the places they were spent time in is speaking in South Africa and other parts of the continent to talk about what it means to be non-aligned in an era of global politics. And it very much is about narrow transactional interests. So mobilizing the global south, mobilizing Africa in support of initiative is going to be more difficult, I think, in this environment. And this may confound Chinese expectations of automatic support from the African contingent in places. So my concluding remarks are a set of things, ideas flowing from all of this. I think that the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, is going to assume its place as a center or keystone to the relationship in ways that it hasn't in the past. Mao himself in 1964 said that Congo was the key to Africa. Maybe now that is true for China anyway. Certainly given the degree to which the green energy resources are absolutely drawn from and necessary to this future economy, and are based in this troubled continent-sized country. We have to ask ourselves: is China really up to the task? Does it know how to operate there? It knows well enough for the time being, but can it continue? Can it grow and develop that? How is it going to face down the challenges of a deeply unstable, fragmented country, absolutely rife with poverty, insurgencies, militias, etc. It's already there, but it's more complicated. The attendant problem to this, to China dealing with the more substantive, is it going to become a state builder, right? Or is it going to be investing in security, and what sort of security? Can it do so in a UN, in the multilateral sphere, in a UN that is echoing a kind of new Cold War? And I would also argue, this is a more general point, is that the United States and the European Union, Japan too, I should put in there, have really not concentrated their resources yet to this problem. They've done a lot of talking, and it can be accused of talking, but they haven't actually put resources, consequential resources on the ground. And we'll see that may change this, make it that competition may complicate China's role in this keystone place. African's security crisis, I just want to flag this as well, is China had a big jolt in 2011 with the what's called the Arab Spring, and it's particularly the Libyan crisis and how it affected its 50 infrastructure project and its 34,000 citizens there, and it got away pretty light for that. All its citizens were saved. I didn't get off light in terms of the infrastructure losses there, but nonetheless, for China, it is yet to face the kind of security crisis of that scale that seems to me, if not inevitable, it's something that you have to factor it in, right? And does China have sufficient resources and abilities to manage that, right? Particularly in an era of global politics and an era of social media, where minutes we could see it with the Israeli-Gaza Palestinian situation. It's, we know before we know, in fact, what's going on. We've got this material there, and that drives things, even in a country where they do have a good handle on top of social media, and that's such as China. As I've said, great power competition comes from many sources. In a multipolar world, it would be seen that way, and China, I think, hasn't as yet sort of factored that in to the degree you would expect. Transactional forms of non-alignment, I've talked about that. And my last point is that everything we say about China and Africa actually took place in the easy era of globalization and unipolarity. All the activities, all the investments, they were rode under. It wasn't really that they rode under occurred under the radar. They were known and recognized and seen in many cases as contributing and in line with Western interests in development there. But now they're read through a different lens. And has Chinese diplomacy, its development cooperation, and all of that, its aims and expectations, has it really adjusted to the era that it wants to proclaim? It has proclaimed, in fact, the new era, but has it actually adjusted to what that really means? That's why I said earlier, we haven't seen yet what Western governments will do in pursuit of their interests, much less India, much less Gulf, much less any of these ones. And it strikes me that this template for the future, as ambitious as it is, nonetheless hasn't been tested against these sort of challenges. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alden, for your very comprehensive and explained presentation. I think that now we have a bit of time for some questions.
I'd like to kick things off. Advise you for formulating new questions. Thanks so much, Chris. That was brilliant. I think, you did an amazing job at sort of setting out potential new avenues. And I wanted to ask a question about a debate that has been very prominent in the old Europe, I guess, around agency. There's been a lot written around it. So I wanted to ask you a little bit around whether you think that the concept will still be helpful in thinking through Chinese engagement in the new era, or perhaps whether you feel it still be a crucial component of the academic literature, but also to what extent will then the Chinese response to the increased moments of tension be shaped by the agency of different African actors, not just state, but also at the subnational level. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll respond to that and directly. I think you're right. I think it's. I mean, it was implied, just by the way, in terms of transactional forms of approach on diplomacy. So I think that for Africa, this represents, again, best case opportunity for exerting its own influence And it over competitive debates or competitive licensing or economic cooperation, what have you. Even in terms of peace and security questions, they have that. There is that enhanced capacity. I do think that African actors already asserting themselves vis-a-vis China, but against others as well. And I mentioned the IGAD and the idea that this door is closed to your involvement at the real substantive level. We want to just keep you. You can contribute, but we'll tell you when you contribute. That kind of thing. So I think that that agency will continue to feature. That the literature of the old era as is of relevance to the new era, and in fact, it anticipates in a way the great era of great power competition. That it assumes that and is probably going to be even more accelerated. If you think now, just to one last comment was, if you think about the way that Mobutu in that era manipulated Western governments to serve his own accumulative interests or what have you. That's a particularly grievous version of that, but there is going to be that suggests that in great era of great competition, there are opportunities there that can even keep leaders in power who might not otherwise survive.
Thank you. Any other questions? While you're thinking, I think I can ask a question. It's very interesting. I was very interested in the topic of human rights. You said that the Global Civilization Initiative is debunking universality of human rights, of the Western values, right? And creating new sources of value. Okay, and also you mentioned the Global Development Initiative with this developmentalist reading of human rights. I think we were shocked. I think that many of us were shocked some 20 years ago when China started questioning the human rights, because this was something taken for granted, right? And it started to question them exactly when, if I remember it correctly, at the first FOCAC meeting, so when they were talking, having a dialogue with African countries, if I'm correct. So my question is, how much purchase power, how much do you think that this new values will easily be accepted in Africa? And or you said that they need Africa for all this. Do you think they will be really able to involve African actors in this endeavor?
Thank you. I want a couple of things. First is the GCI, the Global Civilizations Initiative, as I said, is not fully developed yet. And it fits the kind of classic way that China does engage with the international community. It does so in a kind of iterative way, and it sounds out. What do you think? What do other countries think about a particular issue? And in that way, coalition builds from on the ground, right? About what the shape of that initiative would be. But BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, was similar to an extent, some of that process. Second thing is that I don't think there's any sense that human rights don't. There's a Western, there are human rights that are to the exclusion, exclusively owned by the West as a value. Actually, they're overlap, and they overlap with all these different civilizational initiatives. They all have positions on the sanctity or centrality, not centrality, but sanctity of human life in some way or the other. But it's but they made, I mean, classic thing, collective versus individual, where's the emphasis and the like. I think underlying that is to say this body, the United Nations, has had it has made claims about what are seen to be universal values, that those are rooted in historical experiences and particularities of the West, and that a multipolar world, multipolar UN, a UN that's ready for multipolar polarities, will think in terms of multiple sources of big ideas about who we are, our relationship with state, society, individual, collective, those kinds of questions. That will have the effect, I think, of beginning to both loosen and repurpose some of these policies that flow. Ultimately, it's about the policies. We can have big debates about this discussion. Ultimately, it's about how meaningful, how does this get meaningfully applied? On the comment of Africa, look at the debates on responsibility to protect, which was an initiative that begins in 2001, punted by the Canadians, gained good traction across the system, saying you know, it's about the role of governments that were not abiding by human rights concerns of populations within those segments of populations and the like. China's position in the initial discussions was this is interference. It's not something we would sign up to, as India took the same position, even Brazil took the same position, amongst others. And yet the Chinese ultimately signed up to it, whereas the West Indians did not. And they did so because they saw that African states were advocates of this, were interested in this form of intervention, and Africa that could point to, within recent memory, the Rwanda genocide, and wanting that kind of outside assistance in peace and security issues. So China adjusted in line with African interests, and it did carry the day. Why did China adjust? Partly to stay, you know, not wanting to stray too far from this particular source of support and what have you. Second, I would also say that it understood that you can work through your follow-up conferences that get much less airplay about defining what exactly are the conditions for military intervention. That's on an R2P case. So that if you're in a prized position within the Security Council, right, you have certain privileges to manage this thing in ways that would encourage you to, it would enable you to really, if things went against your interest, you could take action. So I think there was that sensibility that contributed to their thinking on this as well.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for your the Biden administration recently said, we are all in. What do you think they meant? We are all in. They reiterated it a few times. I mean, you said that they're not putting any resources into development specifically. We know that for a lot of it militarily, of course. But is it because US companies are not interested in it? Or are they actually going to get behind it and start a new pivot? Because the US can start. I know you're not here to talk about the US. Is there going to be a new pivot for the US? You know?
US, I've always felt that first, I don't do work on US policy towards Africa. I wrote, yeah, no, one has to have some feel for it, or sense of it in order to have this kind of discussion. I've always felt that the US has very, very particular and specific interests post-Cold War in Africa. Those have been driven far too often by the Department of Defense and its concerns about terrorism. And so we see much that thrust is part of the economic the financing side of U.S. interest there. Development has been particularly flagship around PEPFAR, which is the HIV/AIDS public health issues. So they've done a lot in that particular area. It seems to me that the U.S. has really not gone much beyond that. It continues to speak the rhetoric of it's a minute, meeting with, build back better for Africa, power generation under Obama, and I would say the EU does similar sorts of things. They've been talking about this, diagnosing the problem, telling African government. The number of times I've talked to African either economists or diplomats who say we went for another lecture in Brussels, right? Or the American embassy talked to us, told us what we shouldn't do vis-a-vis China, the debt trap and all of that is an example of that. And to a person, all of the African involved in this say, so give us an alternative, give us some resources, give us some way to do it. So it's hard to know whether he's all in or not, right? But
I mean, that case, now, I get most of my information from Nick Turf and Brad Intercept, and fairness, taking his line. He gives that example with Mali stadium being built. The American government funding, not finding any US corporation interested, and then the Chinese government had to do it.
Yeah.
To do the work. I mean, but is there an example you could do that follow the political security interest? It's competition now with Russia and especially Russia there with the US. Is it agency for Africa, or how is China going to negotiate those kind of seemingly conflicting interests, especially post-Ukraine? Seems this is the big question.
First thing is a way that we haven't used today or in the literature more generally, I rarely see any reference to it. A way to understand China's success in the global South, Africa included, is less about the kind of striking out and China so capable and deep pockets and all of this. And actually, almost all the projects and what have you were things that Western governments had decided were not good things. They might be environmentally suspect. They were, to quote Xi Jinping, they were vanity projects that really had could not meet a developmental objective and what have you. So it was less a story. China in Africa is less a story of China boldly going where Western governments had feared, but rather the West decides not to be involved. And so there was a door that you could go open. And, in the absence of Western interest in funding infrastructure, China comes in, that kind of thing. So maybe we should be reading this in a different way, one that doesn't foreground China so much and really says there's a kind of core foundational relationship that became more marginalized further in the post-Cold War era. And China stepped in at that moment for its own reasons, what have you. So, that may be. I don't know if I think I missed a part of your question.
No, I don't want to hold the time. I want other people to, maybe my question is stimulate other people to.
I'm going to say, no, that's interesting. How do you think the screening of China's loans, for example, in the infrastructure sector will impact the China-Africa relations? Because, as you said, China came into, and you also mentioned the lecture now with demand-driven approach, so drug and infrastructure are very important, but the screening of China's loans, how it will impact.
So the tapering off of these loans, I think it's going to have a big impact. I think that this more specialized. It depends on this other agenda. Unlike previous agendas where they put a price tag to everything, we're going to do this, and it's going to be a part of a larger development finance package. And so really, it's about picking the right project that would support or meet these requirements and what have you. This one does not, but lacks that. So it's a little bit more of an open-ended commitment. Will in Africa. So again, are Western governments going to step in and do anything? Or is it, if they don't, then I think the game is already, or no game, it sounds like it's buying into the great power competition thing. But in any case, they are going to have, the China will have a pretty easy time of it, right? Of maintaining a relationship they might not otherwise have had so easy a time of holding on to in the absence of that big financing that we've seen in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think we have two questions from online. I can read it loud, but I also put it here if it's easy.
Yeah.
So Jacopo is asking, I have a couple of questions on the role and the relevance of media in China's engagement with the African continent. Do you think that there is a clear-cut state-led and coordinated strategy of the People's Republic of China when it comes to media representation of African people and state in order to gain its own influence? CCTN, Africa, the various Africa media, China media agency. And if we take for granted that we are talking about a story of success, how that differ from Western mode of representation? So that's one. The other, do you want?
Let me do that first.
First.
Yeah, I think there's a media strategy. I mean, a long time ago, so 20, I can't remember the year, before 2015, Xi Jinping talked about we need to tell our story and tell it well. And China wants to tell the best story of its, as understood by the CCP, anyway, of China, Africa. And in so doing, it set up a whole media CGTN, as it's called today, in Nairobi. It broadcasts across the continent. You can pick up and also there've been equity purchases, shares for the existing African media. The idea was that this media is too dominated by Western interests or sees the world through a lens that isn't an African lens. There's all of that. The representation of Africa has, by and large, I think, been, I don't know, I don't do the media stuff, but I read about people who do the media assessment, and generally speaking, Africa is explained and told at a level of detail that is absent from other stories. So it's more about development issues and the like. We do see, and what I like particularly about China's efforts is it seems to have inspired other groups like CNN and the like. The French TV always had an Africa role. The Portuguese also always had an Africa role, but to do more and highlight different stories of Africa. So I think the overall, China's helped lift all boats in that area. So we have better stories about more interesting developmental successes, not just famine and conflict. So I think that's been important.
Thank you. So the other question that Sarah has is, she said, among the UA politician and policymaker, there is often a tendency to lump Russia and China together in terms of their African policy. Are there areas of convergence, and what are the main areas of divergence between the two when it comes to Africa?
Yeah, I know a little bit about the Russia stuff, but Russia's very particular sectoral interests. There's basically two domains. One of them is security, arms, large arms trader, training associated with that, security services, in more recent years, the Wagner Group as an expression of that. So there's all of these sort of areas. Then there's sectoral interests in certain kinds of areas of infrastructure, nuclear powers, plants, and that kind of area. So we see extractive, but mostly around particular resources and commitments. So we see a failed a bid on the part of the procurement actually problem in Russia in atom in South Africa, and a more successful one, I think, in Namibia, if I stand to be corrected. So it's very, very specific. It's in sectoral terms, it comes up head to head. It competes head to head, I suppose, with China. But I suppose it's the kind of ordinary competition that you would have in any public procurement policy. The security side is different. One doesn't know what Chinese officials think about Russia and its role there. I don't have any particular insight on that. But I'm guessing, I think the thing to look at would be to look at Security Council and any efforts to criticize Russia's role in in the Sahel, in Central African Republic, the Wagner Group has been, et cetera, to see how what China does. Does it abstain? Does it offer support, et cetera?
Thank you.
Other questions? Here or online?
I think online.
No? Okay, so do you mind moving to the other
Yes,
slides?
maybe I can just do a.
You wanted to ask a question?
Yes,
Okay, please go on.
I have many questions, but one is more an observation because thank you for the presentation, and I really like the point where you were saying that there is a greater competition of power. It's not just about the West and China, and I think it's really interesting to think about when I was early this year in Sudan, and I saw this competition between the Gulf countries in acquiring or controlling land and the agriculture sector and China. And the Gulf states are really strong in the Sahel. And I think this is a conflict of interest of China and the Gulf state and other powers. So on the one hand, I'm asking what this expanding of BRICS will mean in terms of competition, also of controlling resource. And the other point that I was wondering, at some point you say that sometimes it seems that it's just talking and there is not reality in the ground. And when it comes to the discourse of agriculture modernization and green discourse, I have two doubts or question that I'm asking myself sometimes. One, if it's actually possible to promote modernization that it's based on intensive agriculture, hybrid seeds, and to be green at the same time, because I slightly disagree on this idea that we can achieve green development by increasing modernization in agriculture. And the other fact, if it actually in the ground, there are these projects, because what I'm seeing sometimes is that there is a lot in the forum, on the FOCAC, a lot of discourse about agriculture modernization, helping food security and green projects. But then on the ground, I visit the Chinese Center, the Agricultural Technology Demonstration Center in Sudan, it was falling down. There was one people in Tanzania, also they didn't reach an agreement and they go back to the Tanzanian government. So I'm actually wondering if those discourse have a real impact on the ground, or if we are just listening to discourse that need to align with the global discourse that we need to move towards a greener development.
Lots of things. Let me start with the end. Actually, I think what this does, I have also gone to a lot of these, several agricultural technical demonstration centers. And what is notable is how little is there. There are a few where you have some training and some spillover and things that may or may not have worked well. Some cases utterly closed and not have some. Ethiopia closed. In Rwanda, interesting, but they were growing mushrooms to a population that told me Chinese mushrooms that were used to eating these. So I don't know, it seemed irrelevant actually in terms of the local needs and the like. So I think that's a problem. I think what that tells me is all of us who do work in this field have I've inhabited in this discussion the meta level, the big debates, the big discussion. But my preference, and Elisa will confirm that, is for us to talk about actually to balance that with a real field work knowledge of what's going on the ground, because we inhabit this world of words and we can lose touch with what exactly is happening and whether anything is consequential or significant derived from this. So I applaud that you're doing that, because that's the only way we're really going to get at some kind of sense. And I know many of the people here do similar sorts of things. So I would urge you to, make that a feature of this study that will distinguish it from the rhetoric-driven form that we see in other areas of international relations, and development sometimes. On the other question about the Gulf states and competition and this sort of thing, one is I'm not sure what this tells me. I mean, we have India as a BRIC, just specific to that one. We have the Gulf states. It looks like India won't participate, and it's not the first time the Indian government hasn't attended. Sorry, I'm getting that wrong. India will not participate. If we think of the BRI, right, which is very important to China. It's the signature grand strategy, if you like, of Xi Jinping. India didn't attend. The Indian leadership didn't attend before. They're not attending now. When they talk about old friend Vladimir Putin, he means it, because he shows up to all these events, so that I think that BRICS expansion will be of limited value. It will be nice to say we have this amalgamation of over a half of the world's population, so much a percentage of GDP, but mobilizing of what is already a fractious set of relationships between them, that's going to be tough. Where BRICS matters to me, but remains to be seen, is the BRICS Development Bank and the degree to which some of the steps it takes in financial areas, in terms of dealing with currency swaps, in terms of providing an alternative to the SWIFT, the US dominated and US dollar dominated world, that will be interesting. And I think a lot of testing has already gone out there, trying to use the renminbi and see as a currency and all of that of exchange. And Lula has himself in Brazil has expressed enthusiasm for that. So I think that's where we might see some interesting and, if you like, practical application. But in terms of trying to get this very kind of contrary body to move in one voice, I'm be surprised. My last point is with the Gulf, very specific. I did some work with Bura Susler on Turkey's role in Africa. Very interesting. And we're now working on something called Islamic diplomacy. And so the degree to which different states that have that as their heritage, have sought to, in Africa, mobilize that. They use different ways of playing that card, if you want to use that term. And it's something that I think, in going head to head with another competitive bid from a place like China, but it can be other countries too, I think they've demonstrated a pretty clear track record of success. So their money is, they're able to do Islamic banking, Malaysia, for instance. And that has played a role in securing a position within different sectors, agriculture or otherwise. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'm thank you for the presentation. And being well, you were mentioning about Indonesia, and assuming that Indonesia actually already extending their influence in Africa, and you have China or outside of China, with an Indian there. I mean, the two-way relation between China and India or Indonesia in Africa. Can you see more about this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the issue with Indonesia, again, I know a little bit about it. I knew a reasonable amount some years ago, and have sort of taken it up more recently. Is what does Indonesia offer? What is the nature of the economic relationship there? The economic relationship partly is based on some of the classic things of extractive resources where Indonesian firms are involved in that. So securing a position within those markets, those sectors rather, and then Indonesian goods which are traded to small, relatively retail kinds of things in the food area, food and agricultural area that comes to African side. The ambitions, I think, are to see in Africa develop, and Indonesia as well, in terms of small, its initiatives in the digital domain. It actually, if you look domestically within Indonesia, it's great strides have been made in terms of digital economy and that, mostly by small, medium enterprise initiatives. And so looking to find a way to take that and link it up, take the advantage of what is an open field, where a developing country can engage with other developing countries and find common cause, if you like. I mean, China's in this area too, other countries as well, but it's one of the areas that Indonesia hopes to expand in Africa.
Okay, good. So if there are no other questions, before closing the event, I would like to remind everyone that this is the second event organized by AISAC, which was founded just a few months ago, 2 years back. We are preparing a series of events for next year. Is there a problem there?
It's okay.
Good. We are preparing a series of events for next year, the most important of which will be the first AISAC conference to be held in Padua in April 2024. We are also animating a China and Africa section of the Now blog, where you can read and listen to our future podcast. Actually, the first podcast will be a conversation with Prof Alden that will take place just in a few minutes after we are finished here. And starting next January, we will be accepting new members into AISAC. So we invite you all to join. And in the slide that you can see behind me, there is our address and the link to the blog. So thank you again for your participation. And thank you, Professor Prof Alden, for your very, very interesting presentation.
All the work that's gone into this, and it's making it easy for me.